Lord, we thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. As we go into your word, I pray that your Spirit will be present with us, guiding us into understanding. And as we go back into the book of 2 Kings, God, I pray that you will bring to remembrance all the things that we have talked about previously, even though it's a pretty complicated history and it's easy to forget. And if we do forget, God, I pray that you'll be gracious with us and patient with us, because it's a lot to remember. We love you, Lord. By the end of today, may we be better equipped to live for you, and may we be better disciples of you. We love you, God. We praise you. To your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so in that prayer, I mentioned that we are back in 2 Kings, and that is because for several weeks now, we haven't been in 2 Kings. We have been in the book of Isaiah, and that's because as we've been going through 2 Kings, we have been taking little breaks in the story to look at just overviews of the prophets. Just along the way, like we're basically just looking at the prophets in a chronological perspective. And really the main goal is not to give you a deep, in-depth analysis of each of those books. It is simply to provide you with the historical context in which those books fall, so that hopefully on your own, you can go through them on your own and kind of just better understand them, because you'll remember, oh hey, this is taking place at this time period in 2 Kings. And so far, we have gone through Isaiah chapters 1 through, who knows?
Isaiah 1 through 27?
27, yes. We've gone through Isaiah chapters 1 through 27. And technically, we could have just kept on going through the rest of Isaiah, because there's 66 chapters. But instead, I'm pushing those off till later. And the reason why is because whenever you get to chapters 28 through 39 of Isaiah, you're dealing with a guy named Hezekiah. And specifically, chapters 36 through 38 of Isaiah are almost word for word the same as a few chapters in 2 Kings. And we haven't gotten to those chapters yet. And so what I decided is, you know what we're going to do? We're simply going to go back to 2 Kings. We're going to go through chapter 17. And then around that time, the prophet Micah wrote his book. So next week we'll be in the prophet Micah. And then we'll be back in Isaiah. And then Isaiah and Kings are actually going to meet together. And so we'll actually be able to go through Isaiah and Kings at the same time. I know that sounds super complicated, but that's because we're at a complicated time in Israel's history. And God is sending a bunch of prophets to them at this time period, basically just trying to call them out on their stuff and tell them to get their act together. And so if it feels like we're jumping all over the place, that's probably how the people of Israel and Judah felt at this time too. That being said, today's chapter, it's a pretty long chapter, but it's a very monumental chapter. And you can see why it's monumental because of the title that I gave it. Today we are dealing with the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, which is a pretty big deal. Because, ever since 1 Kings chapter 11, I believe it was, or I guess 1 Kings chapter 12, the kingdom has been divided, right? Namely, who are the three kings of the United Kingdom?
That was Saul, David, and Solomon.
Yes, Saul, David, and Solomon. And collectively, that lasted about 120 years, right? But in 930 BC, the year that Solomon died, everything split whenever Rehoboam, Solomon's son, basically did not respond well to Jeroboam. Whenever basically there was this guy named Jeroboam who was he was basically a slave during the time of Solomon, or I guess he wasn't a slave. He was a worker during the time of Solomon, and basically he rebels. And this ultimately punishment for Solomon and his sin and stuff. We don't need to recap all of that, but long story short, for quite some time now, for a little over 200 years, the kingdoms have been split. Right, so in 930 BC they split to where there's the southern kingdom, which is known as Judah, and then there's the northern kingdom, which is known as Israel. And ever since 1 Kings chapter 12, we have been following both of these kingdoms, hence why it's been a bit confusing, because a lot of the kingdoms have kings with similar names and complicated family lines, and I've compared 1 and 2 Kings to Game of Thrones. Because it really does feel kind of like Game of Thrones because of all the political corruption and scheming and sometimes borderline incest that's going on, and just all the terrible violent machinations and just terrible stuff going on. And today in this chapter, we are seeing a lot of the complicated stuff honestly get out of the way. Because so far we have been dealing with a divided kingdom. But from 2 Kings chapter 18 onwards, we're no longer dealing with divided kingdoms. We are dealing with a surviving and struggling to survive kingdom singular. Because after 2 Kings 17, the northern kingdom of Israel is done with. Not that God has abandoned them, but they are out of the picture so far as 2 Kings is concerned. And we're only going to be dealing with Judah for chapters 18 through the end. So after this chapter, it'll actually get a lot simpler. And we'll actually be able to be like, okay, we know who we're talking about, we know what we're dealing with, and it'll be a lot more straightforward. But we're not there yet. Today, we are still in the midst of the complicated stuff. And so let's just hop right in. 2 Kings chapter 17. Since Sean is not here, I will read for us. Sound good? All right. 2 Kings chapter 17, picking up in verse 1, since that is the first verse of the chapter. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah became king over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned for 9 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, went up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Then the king of Assyria went up against the whole land, and he went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and took Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. All right. So like I said, this is a pretty long chapter, but it does not waste any time getting to the main stuff, does it? What happens in these 6 verses?
Hoshea becomes king over Israel in its capital, I believe, Samaria, reigning 9 years.
Yep.
And he's an evil king.
He's bad. But what's the most important thing that happens here? It's at the very end. What did I say the chapter was about?
The
kingdom falls.
Yeah.
Right? In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and took Israel away into exile to Assyria. So it happens, right? It falls in the first 6 verses, and the rest of the chapter that we're going to be talking about is literally just the aftermath and the explanation for why this had to happen, right? So this chapter is actually going to be very applicational because we're going to see the author's going to explain this is why this had to happen this way, and as a result, we're going to learn a little bit about what God expects from his followers.
Well,
Yes, sir.
I believe this all goes back to the point we were reading in the commentary a couple weeks ago, where if we have the kingdoms of Israel and Judah and Israel as a whole, and it exists to like be separate from the world and show the rest of the world how it's supposed to act, and if it's acting like the rest of the world, what's the point of it being there?
Yeah, well, and that's something that I think the author, especially at the end of this chapter, is going to highlight that because if you go way back to them conquering the land, back under the time of Joshua, they were sent in there to wipe out the pagan peoples and be different. But now, they look just like the pagan peoples that they conquered. And so the question becomes, if you're not doing your one job, why are you here? And therefore, God is sending Assyria in to wipe them out. But again, we know that God has made promises to Israel, and so he's not just forsaking them, right? He does have a future plan for them, but they're going to have to be disciplined in order to get there, right? And so that's kind of where we're at in the story. So let's walk through it. Real quick, just as a reminder, because we haven't been in 2 Kings for a while, chapter 16 actually did not deal with Israel at all. It dealt with Judah, and there was one particular king we were looking at. Do you remember what king it was? This is actually the reason why we went into Isaiah afterwards. You can actually know the answer if you look over to the timeline on the side of the screen.
Ahaz?
Ahaz, yes. So since you can see that Hoshea is who we're dealing with the northern kingdom, well, if you go over to who was reigning at that time period, you have Ahaz, the king of Judah. Ahaz was a terrible, terrible dude. And chapter 16 was just talking about how bad he was. If you remember, this is the guy who sacrificed his son to, the pagan gods.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and so Ahaz was not a good dude. And that's why we went into the book of Isaiah, because Isaiah, his ministry begins with him ministering to Ahaz. And Ahaz is the guy that Isaiah goes up to and says, ask for a sign from the Lord. Ahaz refuses to ask for a sign. And Isaiah says, God's going to give you a sign. The virgin will give birth to a son, and you will call him Emmanuel. And so that's why we went into Isaiah. But chapter 16 was not dealing with Israel, it was dealing with Judah. We haven't heard about Israel since chapter 15, right? And chapter 15 introduced us to the bad guys who show up in this chapter because we were introduced to Assyria. Assyria really hasn't been mentioned at all in 2 Kings until the most recent chapters. And when they show up, it's almost by surprise, right? To where we know, in like whenever we talk about the big picture story of the Bible, we know that Assyria, they're a big deal, right? They're the ones who destroy the northern kingdom, and as we're going to see, they almost destroy the southern kingdom. But the way that the author presents them is that their attack almost comes out of nowhere, right? They show up in chapter 15 for the first time, and then bada boom, bada bing, by chapter 17, they've destroyed the kingdom. Yes, sir.
I'm going to try to add a little bit of context here. In verse 17, we see there's some kind of tribute thing going on between the king of Israel, the king of Egypt, and the king of Assyria.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you wonder, when I first read it, I was thinking about, well, how long has this tribute thing been going on if we look back further in the Kings, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think the Bible really specifies how long it's going on, but it just makes you wonder.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, like, Assyria has been, like, historically speaking, we know that Assyria was rising up in power throughout all this time, but I think the author specifically chooses to, like, not mention them for a while, mainly because they're wanting Assyria's appearance to be shocking, right? Mm-hmm. The author has primarily been focusing on the degradation of Yahweh worship in Israel, so that you're supposed to realize these people need to be punished. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, boom, Assyria shows up to wage war. And so that's what we're dealing with. So in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king over Israel in Samaria, and he is going to reign for 9 years. We're going to notice that Hoshea's story begins the same way that every other king's story begins, right? This is like the formula we're used to. In the certain year of so-and-so king of certain kingdom, this other dude began to reign in the other kingdom, and he reigned for this long. However, Hoshea's story is not going to end the same way the other kings ends. Because usually, we're used to the formula saying, and as for the rest of the acts of so-and-so, are they not written in the books of the kings of so-and-so, and he died and was buried with his fathers? That's not how Hoshea's story is going to end. Instead, Hoshea's story ends with him being thrown in prison and his people taken off in captivity. Right? So he does not die as a king. And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Alright? So what do we see there?
That's interesting. I first read that it could mean two different things, right? And the first one I'm more inclined to believe is that maybe he was more evil than his fathers. And then the second option is maybe he was evil just in a different way.
Yeah. So I would actually argue that it would be the opposite in the sense of he was bad, but he actually wasn't as bad as the ones who came before. Yeah. Which is interesting because Hoshea is the one who's going to be king whenever the kingdom's destroyed. And so now we have to answer a question. Why the heck would God make, doesn't that seem kind of messed up? I mean, we know he's bad, but he's not as bad as the other ones. So why is God doing this?
Maybe it has to do with like a remnant.
Okay.
I think
Explain that.
He wasn't as evil as the other kings, so maybe God is sending a message. Just guessing there.
What would the message be?
I'm still faithful to my people.
Okay.
I'm going to be a bit more of a pessimist here, but one thing I may be thinking of is it might be an issue of one step forward, two steps backwards.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
What I kind of mean is Hoshea here is maybe like the one step forward, but as we go back with the other kings, it's maybe like two steps back, and then we occasionally have a good king, and that's a good or okay king, and then that's the one step forward.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think another thing that we have to consider is just the character of God, right? Because we don't really see this phrase showing up in Scripture yet, but once the people go off into exile, there's going to be this phrase that they're going to repeat again and again, and it becomes the most repeated phrase in Scripture. And it happens to be, for those of y'all who have our well t-shirts, the blue ones, it's what's written in gold. What is that phrase? Ki lolam chazdu. For his
Hesed endures forever.
For his hesed endures forever, right?
One more.
The phrase that the Jewish people during the time of the exile began to sing about God again and again is that his hesed endures forever. God is a God of hesed, a God of grace and mercy and loving kindness. And whenever he judges people, he usually doesn't judge them immediately. And so what's ironic about this whole situation is that just like Hoshea is not the worst king that Israel had. Well, if you remember Ahab? Ahab was not the worst king that Judah had, right? Or no, Ahab was the king of Israel too. Remember that was the Omride dynasty? Ahab was the worst king they had, but did God take out Ahab right then? No, remember he said, okay, well, I'm going to show mercy towards you, but your children are going to be destroyed, right? And so God was actually being gracious, right? He didn't judge immediately. Instead, he was patient, right? And he was allowing them to, it's like, okay, you did bad stuff, but rather than just immediately bringing down the hammer, I'm going to give you time to repent. And maybe I'll turn away from your wicked ways. But ultimately they don't. And then eventually they're destroyed, right? So it wasn't Ahab who was destroyed. Yes, he died, but his dynasty didn't end there, right? It was his son who ultimately was the end of the dynasty. In the same way, it's true here, right? Pekah, Hoshea's dad, was the worst king, but it's Hoshea who ends up dealing with it, right? And that's because God's a God of mercy, right? He's patient and he waits, right? And so I think that would be part of it, right? I think it's just the nature of God that he, well, I guess you really can't say the nature of God because God is inherently beyond nature. But it's the character of God that he is patient and he multiplies his hesed to the 1,000th generation, right? And all because judgment arrives here doesn't mean that time period was the worst possible time period. No, he might be doing that judgment for something that had happened 100 years earlier, right? But he is patient and he's giving them time. And so Hoshea is bad, but he's not the worst they had. Also, just another thing I want to highlight. Don't worry, we will start speeding up eventually as we get through this. What's interesting about Hoshea's name? Especially whenever you consider what happens during his reign.
Is the Hebrew close to Joshua?
It is, yes, right? So Hoshea, the name means salvation. And Hoshea was actually the original name of Joshua, right? It's also the same name where we get the name Hosea, right? So the prophet Hosea, it's the same name, right? So Hoshea is where we get the name Joshua, but if you actually go read in the Torah, whenever Moses met Joshua, his name was Hoshea, and Moses changed his name, right? He changed it from Hosea to Joshua, because where Hosea means salvation, Joshua means Yahweh is salvation, right? It's Hoshea and Yehoshua, right? So you're adding Yahweh in there, and Moses was basically saying, your name is great, but it could be better, right? We're making it Yahweh is salvation. And so why do I say that's significant? The Yahweh thing set apart. Just the fact that Hoshea has the same name as Joshua, why would I say that's significant given what happens here during his reign?
What was the question?
Why is it significant that Hoshea basically shares names with Joshua, given what happens during the reign of Hoshea?
Is it them going off into exile? Well, to me it seems like it's almost opposite because Joshua was bringing people from exile into the promised land, and it's almost the opposite. He's going from the promised land into exile.
Yeah, it's almost like God played the Uno reverse card, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's reversal, right? Joshua led the people into the land, and he told them, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Hoshea and his house did not serve the Lord, and therefore he is leading the people out of the land into exile as punishment for their sin. Right? Joshua, he was one of the faithful spies who said, God can give us this land, we just have to serve him, and therefore he was rewarded as being one of the two people who was able to enter the promised land. Hoshea, well, he was not faithful, and therefore he's leaving. Ironically, who's ultimately going to be the one who leads the people back from exile? Not just physically, but spiritually. Jesus, whose name comes from Joshua, right? And so if you're just looking at this, like the names are significant, right? You have Joshua, Hosea, and Jesus, which are all different forms of the same name, right? Joshua is Yehoshua, which is also Hosea, and then Jesus is Jesus, which comes from Yeshua, which is Yehoshua. It's all the same stuff, right? It's just different forms of the same name. And so Joshua leads the people into the promised land. Hosea leads them out of the promised land, and Jesus metaphorically leads them back in, and physically he actually leads them back in, because where does his ministry begin? Where does his ministry literally begin?
Was it the Jordan River?
The Jordan River,
Yeah.
right? Boom. Just like Joshua led them in through the Jordan River, Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River and passes into the land, right? And so I just want to highlight that. That's kind of cool. But yeah, so Hosea then was evil in the sight of Yahweh, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, went up against him, and Hosea became his servant and paid him tribute. Well, hold up. I thought that in previous chapters, we read that this guy named Pul was the king of Assyria, and I thought that we talked about how Pul was just a shortened version of the name Tiglath-Pileser. So we thought Tiglath-Pileser was the king of Assyria. Why is it saying Shalmaneser is the king of Assyria? What's going on there? Fun fact, this isn't actually a trick question.
Right,
It's just another name, like it's a synonym or something. Like
No, it's actually that time has passed. And so Shalmaneser is Tiglath-Pileser's son.
Oh.
So it was more just I was framing it like a trick question, but really it's just Tiglath-Pileser died, and Shalmaneser is his son. I actually believe that Tiglath-Pileser died the year that that Israel fell. So I could be wrong there. I have to look it up.
Are you pulling the right from Second Kings or the extra?
Extra biblical stuff. I believe we know that extra biblically.
Okay.
Actually, that might be in the Bible as well, but I'm pretty sure that we know that Tiglath-Pileser died around the same time period. So, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, he went up against him, and Hosea became his servant and paid him tribute. So it does seem like this is the moment whenever he begins paying tribute to Assyria. We don't know whenever he formed the stuff with Egypt, but this also does tie into stuff we talked about in Isaiah. Because if you remember, and we actually talked about this in 2 Kings 16 as well, what was Ahaz so afraid of? Right? Ahaz being the king of Judah. Back in chapter 16. Do you recall? Remember, this is why Isaiah even had to confront him and say, what are you afraid of?
He was afraid of something, I just forgot what it was.
We talked about it, I think, 3 different times now.
Was it the sign?
Well, eventually, this is why Isaiah asked for the sign, or this is why Isaiah gives the sign. Basically, what happened is this, right? During Ahaz's reign, Assyria is growing in power, right? And Aram and Israel, right? So Syria and Israel, they were terrified of Assyria, and therefore they realized they needed to mount up some armies in order to be able to defend themselves from Assyria. And so they turned their attention down to Judah, and they basically kind of gave them an ultimatum. They said, either join us or be destroyed by us and be forced to join us, right? And so Ahaz was terrified, right? And so Ahaz is trying to figure out, what the heck do I do? And that's why Isaiah came in, and Isaiah said, hey, don't be afraid of Aram and Israel. They're going to be destroyed very soon, right? Assyria is going to come down and destroy them. He says, you simply need to trust in God. But that's not what Ahaz did, right? And we read about this back in chapter 16. Instead, what Ahaz did is he went up to Assyria and he started paying them tribute and being like, hey, we should be friends. And so Ahaz partnered with Assyria. But what we see here is the aftermath of that. To where eventually what happens is, just like God promised, Assyria comes down. They've already conquered Syria, or Aram, and now they're making their way down and they're getting ready to conquer Israel too. Right? And so this is literally what God said was going to happen. So the king of Assyria, or Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, went up against him. Hosea became his servant, paid him tribute. So they're not destroyed yet, but they're on their way there. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. So what happens here?
I think that Israel and Egypt are starting to conspire against Assyria, he's like, look, I know we haven't had the best relationship in the past, but we need to take these guys out before they become a bigger problem.
Yeah.
Interesting Middle East political.
Yeah, they're desperate, right? Because again, if you just like put all the different Bible passages together, we're kind of getting a better picture of what's going on here. Assyria is coming down, and for some time, Israel just pays them tribute because they realize we are outnumbered. They try to go down to Judah for help, but Judah refuses to help. Judah has sided with Assyria. And so what they say is, well, you know what? Let's go further south. And so if you go past Judah, you keep going south, where do you get?
Eventually get to the Dead Sea.
Yes, but
Eventually.
in this context, who does he go? Who do they go to eventually? Who does he partner with?
Aaron?
Where were they freed from during the Exodus? Egypt. Very good. Yes. So he goes down to Egypt, right? Because if you can pick, you have to kind of picture the map in your head to visualize this. Assyria is conquering from the north, right? So Assyria, they have destroyed Syria, which is directly north of Israel. They are now at Israel. Israel goes to Judah. Judah refuses to help. So now they go past Judah. They go down to Egypt, and they say, "Will you help us?" And it seems like Egypt is willing to help. And so all of a sudden, Israel starts getting confident. And they say, you know what? Forget it. We're not paying you money anymore, Assyria, because they're getting ready, they want to fight back. Well, turns out Assyria hears about this, right? Shalmaneser hears about it. And is he happy?
No.
No. He's like, I want my tribute money. The only reason I hadn't destroyed you is because you were paying me. And so, when he hears about this, it says, therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Turns out Hoshea was not as smart as he thought he was. Right? He thought that maybe if he partnered with Egypt, they stood a chance. This is where Assyria says, oh, no. Let me be clear. I am the captain now. Y'all ever seen the movie The Princess Bride? Yes? Great movie. You know the scene where Inigo Montoya and Wesley they're fighting swords? They're sword battling up on top of the Cliffs of Doom or whatever it's called, or Cliffs of Despair. I forget what they're called.
The Eclipse of Insanity.
Cliff of Insanity, there it is. Do y'all remember that scene where they're like fighting?
Yeah.
And one of them reveals and says like, oh, but what you didn't know is that I'm actually right-handed. And then he switches swords, and he realizes that he's been fighting it like he was just like tricking them into thinking he was weaker. But then the other guy says, but what you didn't know is I'm also right-handed. And then he like switches again. That's what I feel this is kind of like, to where you have Israel and Assyria both trying to flex on each other, right? And Assyria wins, right? Israel says, ha ha ha, I was only paying tribute because I wanted you to think that I didn't have help. But I do have help, and it's Egypt. And so he thinks that he did a one-up on Assyria. But then Assyria says, you thought the only reason I wasn't destroying you is because I couldn't. But turns out I actually can. So it's like, it turns out like both of them are trying to trick the other. Assyria wins, right? And so ultimately, Shalmaneser, he takes Hoshea, he displaces him, and he puts him in prison. And so Israel essentially has no king at this point. Not a good look. Verse 5, then the king of Assyria went up against the whole land, and he went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. What's the significance of Samaria?
It's a town that Jesus had to pass through, I think.
So later, isn't it a mixture of Jews, but like not correctly?
Yes, and we'll actually get to that at the end of this chapter.
How was this?
But I'm just asking, like, I'm not asking for a deep question. What's the significance of Samaria at this time period?
Geographical location-wise?
Yes, like, what's the significance of it?
Location.
Let me answer this way. Samaria is to Israel as Jerusalem is to Judah. What's the significance?
Capital.
It's the capital city, right? So that's why they're laying siege to Samaria in particular. The idea is that they have conquered everything except for the capital, and he lays siege. What is it? What does it mean whenever you lay siege?
You surround the city.
Yeah, you absolutely surround it, and you just wait them out, right? You're not fighting them. You're just waiting for them to die. Pretty miserable experience. Probably kind of boring for the army who's surrounding them, but not at all boring for the people on the inside because they're just trying to figure out how to survive.
They're going to get you, and the people inside there have no food.
Yeah. And so they besiege it for 3 years, right, from 725 to 722 BC. And then in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria and took Israel away into exile and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. So right there, the reason why I wanted to spend some more time on this is because this is a super significant moment in the history of not only the Northern Kingdom, but all Israel together. Because keep in mind, how many tribes does the Northern Kingdom consist of? Of the 12 tribes?
10?
10. Yeah. So right here, 10 of the tribes, boom, gone. Right? Israel has just been reduced to 2 tribes. What 2 tribes? Judah. And he's in this room. Benjamin. There you go. Judah and Benjamin.
I was actually thinking
Yes.
that.
Is that tribe
Yes.
in
The tribe is not here, but yeah. Yeah, so right here, this is a big moment, right? Israel is sent off into exile. And ultimately, this is foreshadowing. Because this 2 Kings is not over yet, but this is not the last exile we're going to see, right? Both Israel and Judah are going to have to go into exile.
Can I ask what
yeah.
when it's saying settling? So like they're taking the Jewish people and like pushing around like what's going on there?
Yeah,
Is
so-
that enslavement? Like what's going on?
We'll read more about this later on.
Okay.
Like later on in this chapter, more details about it. But basically, what Assyria did, like their method of conquest, is that they would displace people, right? So they would conquer people, and rather than enslaving them in that area, they would take those people and they would force them to live somewhere else. And then they would take people from that other place and force them to live there. And the effect of that was basically you had a melting pot of cultures where nobody knew how to speak to each other. They all had different customs, and there weren't enough of the people in a single spot to be unified in an effort to rebel. Right? Yeah. So, like, if you just if they just conquered Israel, well, you might have an issue like what Egypt was afraid of whenever they enslaved Israel, right? They were afraid, oh crud, these people have turned into like a nation. What if they overthrow us? Well, Assyria didn't want that to happen, and so Assyria they're saying, we're going to show you how powerful we are. We're going to take you from your home and force you to live somewhere else with a bunch of people you cannot communicate with, who you don't share values with, and y'all can't rise up against us. And so it's just a power move. The reason they're going to come back is because whenever the Persians are in charge, they're going to have a totally different mindset. They're going to realize that if you have that mindset, eventually you're just going to be destroyed. Because even if people don't know how to communicate with each other, they're going to resent that.
Share the same
Yeah,
distaste.
like they're going to resent the heck out of you. And so this mentality is very much dependent on you having a lot of power, right? You have to be able to back up this power move. Whereas the Persians are going to kind of say, we would actually rather people like us, and so we're going to allow people to return back to their homes so that they actually appreciate us being in charge. And so that's why you don't have anybody, like you don't have the Jewish people rebelling against the Persians, because the Persians are the ones who say, hey, we will let you go back home and we will even fund you rebuilding the temple. And so they're like, oh, y'all are great. We love you. And so,
do I have the right thing here where you must have been covering like chapter 16 in the prior weeks, where the powerful players all overestimate like, no, I'm the most powerful. Like I'm Assyria, I'm Israel. They all think the military leaders or the kings or whatever.
yeah.
They all think they're more powerful than the other guy.
Kind of. I mean, I don't think Second Kings has really emphasized that a whole lot, because it's been more emphasized on like the religious, like the spiritual falling away. But you definitely do see that hinted at throughout Scripture. And
I
stuff
just
like
mean
that.
the last since the last couple weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so a little bit. All right. Now that we've spent about 40 minutes on 6 verses, let's go through the rest of the chapter. 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 12. Now this happened because the sons of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed from before the sons of Israel, and in the statutes of the kings of Israel which they had made. And the sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right against Yahweh their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. And they set for themselves sacred pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they burnt incense on all the high places, as the nations did which Yahweh had taken away into exile before them. and they did evil things, provoking Yahweh to anger. And they served idols, concerning which Yahweh had said to them, you shall not do this thing. Right? You see what I said whenever I said the author is going to come in and explain why this had to happen?
Yeah.
Right? Because whenever you see Israel taken off into captivity, if you're not thinking in terms of the Torah, what might you be afraid of?
Well, maybe the army is just
Yeah.
the one that's doing it. Like they're more powerful.
Yeah. Or maybe strictly from a naturalistic perspective, what does this look like?
So like
What
they're
that Israel has done for it.
Yeah, it looks like
Yeah.
Israel's destroyed.
There's nothing
Oh,
that's going to
yeah.
come of them.
Yeah, it looks like Israel's destroyed, and it would almost seem to suggest that God has failed.
Yeah.
Right?
And he's broken.
Yeah. And so you read this, you're like, oh my gosh,
Right.
how is this possible? And so the author feels the need, because really the author doesn't over-explain things throughout 2 Kings. A lot of times he just tells us what happened. But right here he says, I need to clarify. All of this had to happen. Right? God didn't mess up. This wasn't a whoopsies from God where he like fell asleep or something and let Assyria destroy Israel. He says, no. This was necessary. And he says, and let me explain to you why it was necessary. So what are some of the reasons that he shares?
Well, my thing would be incense, like burning the wrong things to the wrong gods.
Mm-hmm.
That's like 10 Commandments level, just not a good thing to do.
Yeah, yes, that's true.
You read
For
this
sure.
and it's kind of like, where do you even start, right?
Yeah.
You can just go basically versus. You can just basically say, pretty much the whole thing is why.
Well, and that really is what it is, yeah. Like, because he basically just gives it point by point by point. But what is the, like, if you were to summarize it, what is the main issue?
You shall have no other gods before me.
Yeah.
it's real
Yeah.
Always the God. But the,
turned away from God.
Yeah.
So
I feel like that's the biggest thing. First command of the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, and that's actually something, I think I alluded to this. Yeah, I think I alluded to this in previous weeks, but I had gotten this from the commentary. I want to read it real quick. Let me say something before I get there. But it ties into exactly what you said, this being a violation of the first commandment. Because in reality, there are 613 commands in the Torah. And Jesus, he of course says that you can summarize all of them by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then also love your neighbor as yourself. And in addition to that, I would argue that in another way, you could also summarize it with that first command. You shall have no other God before me. I think that Jesus' summary is better because his summary calls to mind a specific command which communicates what you do with that, right? So like, whenever God says, have no other God before me, what he means is love me, right? And he means love others, right? So I get why Jesus uses that verse because he's saying that's what it looks like to have no other God before him.
Yeah, no, it's kind of like come to me as you are, and then you
Yes.
have all these other issues. But as long as you love me and you seek after me, we can work on those.
Yeah. But the main thing I want to highlight here is something that oftentimes we misunderstand, especially as Christians, right? A lot of the times as Christians, we almost like talk about the Torah, like the law. We almost talk about the law and faith as if they're like opposites, right? Oh yeah, back then there was the law, now there's faith. That's a false dichotomy, right? In reality, the law itself was a call to faith, right? And that's what you see in that first command. You shall have no other God before me. And all the other commands are an expression of that first command, right? Why is it that you honor the Sabbath day? Because God says so, right? Why is it you don't commit adultery? Because God says so, right? Why is it that they would put the tassels on the robes? Because God says so, right? It's like they are living by faith in God.
I heard it's something
Right.
you don't murder because life is valuable.
yeah.
Yes. Well, yeah, like there's other reasons for it, right? There's also other reasons why you shouldn't commit adultery, right? It's also just a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
But the primary reason is God said so, right? And that's why Jesus got so mad at the religious leaders at the time, because in many ways they had distorted the fact that the Torah was a call to faith. They had almost reduced it to simply a matter of actions. But from the very beginning, you can never fulfill the Torah if your heart was not the thing committed to being obedient, right? It all flows from the heart. If you're
If
like
they
you
love
cannot
you.
commit adultery But if you're not being faithful to God, then you're still sinning. You know what I mean? It starts with a heart of faithfulness to God, and from that faithfulness, obedience follows.
So if they were loving God, they would be obedient to His rules.
Yes.
If they loved Him first, then the rules would just
Yes, and so it only like every command of the Torah is only truly fulfilled if it is preceded by a heart of obedience, right? And so you can have somebody who, in their heads, they said, "Yes, I have checked off every box. I have fulfilled all 613 commands," but if their heart has ever strayed even slightly, they have not fulfilled the Torah, right? Because it's a matter of breaking faith, right? And that's why Jesus is the only one, because Jesus is the only one who is truly faithful from beginning to end. And so I wanted to quote this from the commentary. It says this: Torah is not in conflict with faith. As 2 Kings chapter 17 makes clear, the law is simply a call to faith, and the northern kingdom is packed away into exile because it did not believe in Yahweh their God. We're going to see that in verse 14. The chapter's overwhelming emphasis on Israel's violation of the first commandment shows that loyalty to God is always the crucial, and in some sense, the sole demand for Israel. That's really all God asks, right? He just wants them to be faithful. As Frethheim notes, the language of forsaking the covenant is oriented almost exclusively in terms of the first commandment. And he suggests that the Sinaitic and Davidic covenants are two phases of a single covenant seen from different perspectives. Right? So the idea is that literally everything we see throughout Scripture is a development of that first command. You shall have no other God before me. And that's why you do all the other stuff. And so while the author lists out a million different things that explain why Israel had to go into captivity, the only reason all those things are big deals is because every single one of them is a violation of the first commandment. Right? Every single one of them shows how they have chosen to worship somebody other than Yahweh. And that's what made David so different, right? Because even whenever David sinned, who did he feel most like whenever he sinned against a person, yeah, like he felt worse about how he had betrayed God than even how he had betrayed people, right? Whenever he sins against Bathsheba and Uriah and stuff like that, he says, "Against you and you only have I sinned." He's not saying that God's literally the only one who ever sinned against, but he's saying that's who I feel it against most, because he realizes that he has betrayed God, right? First and foremost. Yes, he betrayed a bunch of other people too, but Yahweh's at the forefront of his mind, right? And so with that in mind, I think we can read through this a lot quicker, because that's the main point, right? Now this happened because the sons of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God. And in case you forgot who Yahweh is and why it's so messed up that they sinned against him, he says, let me remind you what he did. He had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods. Now, why is it ironic that he brings up Egypt right now?
He's reminding them that God brought them out of Egypt, with his faithfulness.
Yes, so there's already this history with Egypt, but why is it ironic that he brought it up just now? What did we read in the previous verses?
What they're doing is sinful and unfaithful to God.
But why is it that Assyria turned on Israel?
Specifically.
Like, the primary external reason is that they were conspiring with Egypt and not sending tribute.
Yes. So do you see the irony here?
Mm-hmm.
The reason they went into exile is because they chose to go back to Egypt. Right? God delivered them from Egypt. Yet, in their efforts to overcome Assyria, rather than going to God, who'd they go back to? Egypt. They haven't left the wilderness, right? Remember whenever they were in the wilderness right after the Exodus? They said, oh, we want to go back to Egypt. Egypt was great. We love Egypt. Well, they did it again. Right? God took them out of Egypt, and where'd they go? Right back down to Egypt. Right? They went to Egypt and said, can you help us? Who should they have gone to? God. If they'd gone to God, he would have delivered them from Assyria. That's what's going to happen with Judah. Right? Because guess what? After Assyria conquers Israel, where are they going next?
Egypt.
Who's in between Egypt and Israel?
The wilderness.
Who's south of Israel? Southern Kingdom.
Judah.
Oh.
Judah. Very good. Yes. Right? So after they conquer Israel, Assyria is going to go to Judah, and they're going to lay siege to Jerusalem. And this king named Hezekiah is going to call upon God, and God's going to deliver him. Right? And so that's what we see here is going to be a comparison and contrast. Right? Israel decides to go back to Egypt, and therefore they go back into exile. Right? If you want to be slaves like you were in Egypt, have fun. Right? That God's a gentleman. Right? He'll give you what you ask for. right? Whenever they asked for a king, he said, I'll give you a king. You want a king like the nations? Meet King Saul, right? Now, Israel goes down to Egypt. Oh, you want to be slaves again? All right, have fun in exile. Assyria is going to come for you, right? So there's this irony to it. So they'd sinned against Yahweh by trusting in other gods, right? They thought that the gods of Egypt could help them. And they walked in the statutes of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed from before the sons of Israel, and in the statutes of the kings of Israel which they had made. All right, so who did they act like?
The nations around them.
The nations whom
Or before them.
Yahweh had dispossessed from before the sons of Israel. When is that referring to?
Is that back in Exodus?
Not in Exodus, but
Joshua?
Joshua, right? Whenever Joshua led them into the land, and they kicked out the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Amorites and the Hittites and the termites and all that stuff, whenever they kicked out all those people, the reason why they kicked them out is because they were evil pagan people, right? Nowadays people get so, it's so weird. Like, whenever skeptics start talking about the Bible, for some reason they feel so terrible for the Canaanites. They're like, oh my gosh, those poor Canaanites, I can't believe God told Israel to wipe them out. They were terrible. They were sacrificing their children, right? These people needed to be destroyed.
Interesting note from the skeptics, there is historical references from the Bible. Well, there was argue that the Bible's inaccurate because it says these people, this God existed. These people, this God existed. And we'll say there's no archaeological evidence. That never happened. And they'll discover gods prior that have existed, but they lost so much recognition and power throughout history that we lost them in history.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that's actually a funny thing, too. But yeah, so, like the irony here is it's really heartbreaking, honestly, right? Because God had delivered them from Egypt, yet they went back down to Egypt for help, right? God had told them to conquer the Canaanites, but instead, what did they do? They basically just became the Canaanites 2.0, right? It's like, well, that's not what you're supposed to do. Like, he called them to be a free people, yet they chose to be slaves. He called them to be a holy people, yet they chose to be like the world. You can see where the application comes from here, right? Because you see that as Christians, it's possible for us to choose the same thing, right? For freedom, Christ has set us free, right? Like we should be living in freedom, yet on a day-to-day basis, sometimes we choose to live in slavery still, right? God has called us to be holy and set apart, yet oftentimes we choose to be like the world. And I hate to break it to you, but the story doesn't end well for Israel here.
I was gonna say it's like the dog returning to its own vomit.
Yes.
And
As the
now-
dog returning to his vomit, so the
that
fool
passage
returns to
from?
his folly.
Yeah.
Proverbs.
It's just the same cycle over and over again.
Downright gross.
But the wisdom is like it's always just.
Yeah.
We're there now.
Yeah, but it's total folly, yet we do it too, right? So it's easy for us to look at Israel and be like, oh, stupid Israel. That's us. We do the same thing, right? They walked in the statutes of the kings of Israel, which they had made, right? Whenever it says the statutes of the king of Israel, what is that referring to?
Statutes of what? Statutes of the kings of Israel.
The things they have established.
Is there
Yeah, the things that they established, right? So
but I was gonna say that more of the man-made rules rather than godly.
Yes, right. Yeah, that they're following man-made traditions and stuff. Over the 200 years that Israel existed, the Northern Kingdom, there are 20 different kings, 9 different dynasties, and 7 different assassinations that lead to switches in dynasties. Yeah, no, it's pretty bad, right? Very politically unstable, right? That's over the course of 200 years, which is a very short amount of time. That's like an extremely short amount of time. But throughout this whole time period, guess how many kings of Israel was good? How many kings of Israel were good?
King David was.
Of the divided kingdom. Of the northern kingdom of Israel, how many kings were good?
I'm gonna guess 5.
None.
None of them.
0.
Yeah.
0 kings.
I was gonna say, they say
Yes.
some are okay, but
Oh,
they're
wait.
not good.
Yes.
Dude,
Zero kings of the northern kingdom were
Oh
good.
no, the northern.
Every single one of them, it says they did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. Right? Out of those 20 kings. Right? It's terrible. They're all bad. And it says that Israel chose to follow in the statutes of the kings of Israel. So not only were the kings sinful, but every single one of them was sinful.
And
And whenever you think of the very first king of Israel, you know what one of his statues was, right? He created a whole new religion, right? He created the 2 golden calves. He put them in Bethel and Dan. He appointed a new priesthood, all sorts of stuff. And we know that that's been something that they've been doing the whole time. So they have not been able to escape this. Were you going to say something?
Oh, I was gonna say, and that is why people that are leaders are judged more strictly, because the people that are following you are gonna be no better than you.
Yes.
Because they're looking to you. Whether you're a teacher or a leader, whatever it is, those people are watching you and following what you do. So if the kings are bad, then you know that the people are too.
Yeah. If you want to know the state of a nation, look at its leaders. If you want to know the state of a school, look at its leaders. If you want to know the state of a workplace, look at its leaders. Right? The people who are employed there or who are under that authority, they will never be better. Or if they are, they're an exception to the rule. Right? Because if the majority were better, then that person would not be in charge. You know what I mean? And so, yeah. Verse 9, and the sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right against Yahweh their God. They did things secretly. Secretly from who? Because Yahweh knew. Right? But the way that they lived, it was as if they thought they could get away with it in secret. Which again is something that we should be aware of. Right? Whenever we think that we're sinning in secret, the only people we're hiding it from is man. Right? We're making other people think that we're righteous, but in reality, God sees everything, and He knows our hearts. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. Right? Every single city you go to, whether it's a big place, a small place, everywhere, they all had high places. When you say high places, what are you referring to?
The Asherah?
Like a place of worship, right?
Yeah.
So just a high place in general, it's, it basically a hill. You would go up there, and hills are, where heaven meets earth, right? So they would worship all the different gods in every single place. I imagine some of this is hyperbolic, right? Maybe not. I mean, it could be that it was so bad that literally every hill had a
I don't know. In the South,
altar.
we have churches of Baptists across.
Yeah, no,
we have
it's
so many
possible.
I saw one the right across.
Yeah.
Right across on the same corner.
Yep. And they set for themselves sacred pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. We saw the same phrase in previous chapters, basically just emphasizing the depth of sin. To me, it calls to mind Genesis chapter 6, whenever it says that God looked at the hearts of man and He saw that every thought, every desire of the thoughts of their heart was only evil continually. Like, the idea is that everywhere there is sin, right? Like, you don't even have to look deeply or thoroughly to find the idolatry. It's everywhere. So it's not they're not just disobeying the law. It almost looks like they're going out of their way to disobey the law. God says, don't make any idols. They said, did you say to put idols everywhere? It's like, no, it's the opposite. Yeah. And there they burnt incense on all the high places, as the nations did, which Yahweh had taken away into exile before them. You notice what language it uses there? Yahweh had taken them into exile? It says that God took the nations. Keep in mind the term for the name for nations there in Hebrew, it's the same word that can be translated as Gentiles, right? So whenever it says the nations that Yahweh had displaced or taken to exile, who's it referring to? Same people we talked about before.
The Israelites.
No,
Not the Canaanites.
the Canaanites, yes, right? But as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that we've heard the Canaanites, like expulsion and stuff, being described as an exile. But why do you think that the author chooses to frame the Canaanites as being exiled here? Like, why do you think he introduces that language in regards to the Canaanites?
Because they were very bad people.
Yeah, yes, but we already knew the Canaanites were bad people. But why is he all of a sudden using exile language to describe the Canaanites?
He's drawing a parallel between Israel and the Canaanites, and they're no better. They're just like them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Like, yeah.
Exactly. It's not saying it's saying.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
they're
So
bad.
he,
Israel's just like.
yeah,
them.
he's bringing the term exile in association with Canaanites
That's-
because he already used that term in regards to Israel.
Yeah.
So he's pointing out that the Israelites have become Canaan 2.0, right? Here we thought that, and also this is Deuteronomy 32 stuff right here. Get ready. If Israel is if the Canaanites were going in exile, who was it who displaced them?
Israel.
Israel. All right. So now, if Israel is going into exile, who's going to displace them?
The Canaanites.
The Canaanites. the time, the Gentiles, I guess,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, the nations, right?
Okay.
So, AKA, the time of the Gentiles is upon us,
Okay.
right? Which is, Deuteronomy
Which
32.
is funny because just because how it puts down Israel fell,
Yes.
and so it sounds good like if we were the Gentiles it was our time.
Yeah.
But that's because first Israel.
Yeah. No, and that's something like Deuteronomy 32. It says, if you will make me jealous with what is not a God, I will make you jealous with what is not a people.
Okay.
Right? And so basically we see God says, okay, if you won't be the light to the Gentiles, maybe the Gentiles will be a light to you. And so he says, you conquered the Canaanites. Well, now I'm going to send other nations to conquer you. And maybe through them experiencing success over you, you will repent and come back to me. Right? And so this is how God works with Israel in general. And so I think it's interesting that he used the word exile there. And they did evil things, provoking Yahweh to anger. Keep in mind, what do we know about God and his anger?
He's slow to anger.
He's slow to anger, but they provoked him really good. Right? And keep in mind the word slow to anger in Hebrew, if you're like, I really like the physicality of the Hebrew language. It literally means he is long of nose. Right? The idea is that he has got huge nostrils and it takes a while for him to start flaring those nostrils. But Israel, he got the nostrils flaring. Or they got his nostrils flaring.
Yeah, that's
And they served idols, concerning which Yahweh had said to them, you shall not do this thing. So they basically took what Yahweh said and did the opposite.
Yeah.
All right, verses 13 through 18. Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by the hand of all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I had commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by the hand of my slaves the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers, who did not believe in Yahweh their God. They also rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he cut with their fathers, and his warnings, with which he warned them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which Yahweh had commanded them not to do like them. And they forsook all the commandments of Yahweh their God, and made for themselves molten images, even to calves,
Yeah.
and made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire, and practiced divination and omens, and sold themselves to do what is evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. There's that phrase again. So Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and caused them to depart from his presence. None was left except the tribe of Judah alone. Keep in mind, Benjamin falls into the tribe of Judah in this case. Like they've kind of merged at this point. They're being treated as one. All right. So, what do we see here?
Israel is being very, very evil.
Naughty.
Yeah, evil.
Naughty.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Problem. Oh.
Yes, they are being quite literally the definition of a problem. Well, actually,
Yeah.
worse than a problem child.
Worse than a problem. Yeah.
Yes. So this is from the commentary, ties into these verses. Israel's fall is not merely a result of its unfaithfulness to the covenant of the first instance, but a result of its defiance of Yahweh in the face of his patience and his repeated appeals to the prophets. Right? So this actually adds insult to injury. That's what we see in these verses. Right? It was already bad enough that they abandoned the Torah. But God didn't just give them the Torah, did he? No, he gave them prophet after prophet after prophet. Throughout 2 Kings, we've seen two primary prophets who were sent to the northern kingdom. What were their names?
Prophets.
Who are the two primary prophets we saw in 2 Kings? 1st and 2nd Kings. Their names sound similar.
Elijah and Elisha.
Yes, Elijah and Elisha. Right? Those are two prophets who were sent to Israel. But then, in our overview of the prophets, we talked about some others. There was Hosea. There was Amos. Right? And then, even throughout Kings, we've read about schools of the prophets in the land. So we know that God sent them all sorts of prophets who warned them and told them, repent and turn to God. Right? So it's not like God was just wanting, like, it would have been enough for God to just give the Torah, right? He could have said, hey, I gave you the rules and you broke them. That could have been enough. He could have destroyed them for that. Because according to the Torah, that's what it says. Remember Deuteronomy 27:28? It says, if you do not obey the Torah, you're going to get kicked out of the land. But God didn't just give the Torah. He gave them prophets. He gave them warnings. He gave them admonitions. He gave further instructions. And they rejected all of it. And they refused to listen. And that's why God is so mad, right? It's adding insult to injury, right? Because he tried to be gracious, yet they rejected his grace. And therefore they condemned themselves. And that's what we read, right? Verse 13. Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah. Whoa, hold up. We got to talk about that. Why is Judah suddenly being mentioned here? What does this inform us?
Both kingdoms
Are responsible.
Both kingdoms are guilty, and therefore I think that the author just revealed the end of the book, right? It's kind of a spoiler, right? Because so far we just saw Israel get destroyed, but what is the author telling us right now?
Judah's going to get their butt kicked as well.
Yeah, Judah's guilty of the same stuff, right? So right now we're basically, this story is a warning to Judah, right? They're supposed to look at this and say, oh crap, we better repent. But they're not going to,
They're not.
right? And so they're not going to learn the lesson.
So what's happening is this happened to Israel, and then Judah would have
Yes,
read this?
Judah's going to last. Judah wouldn't necessarily have read this book at the time, but they would have heard about the events for
Yeah,
sure.
the
And
events for
and
sure.
what we see is that there's prophets warning them, right? I mean, we've been going through Isaiah, right? Isaiah is telling them, don't go down to Egypt, right? Don't go up to Assyria. Don't do that. He's saying, trust in God, right? That's why the prophets are telling them these things. They're saying the same thing that 2 Kings is saying, right? And so the author is revealing right here, yeah, Judah's going to be destroyed too. Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by the hand of all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn away from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent you by the hand of my slaves the prophets. And you can imagine what they probably said. Those commands are so outdated. Right? Gosh, God, that was so 700 years ago. That was like during the time of Moses. Our culture's different nowadays. Those were commands given to slaves. We're different people, right? Canaan, they're long gone. We're different, God. We have that freedom. The reason I say that is because that's what people try to say nowadays, right? When it comes to reading scripture. Oh, God is so outdated. He's so traditional. If only he knew. Like, our culture's different, right? God needs to get up with the culture. That's how people describe God now.
Well, then you get progressive Christianity as a result.
That's where you get progressive Christianity, and that is why the church is probably due for some discipline from God. Yeah. So, there's parallels for sure. Let's make sure that we are not being like them. Let's heed the words of the prophets. However, they did not listen. They did not shema. Right? They were called to hear, but they did not hear. But instead, they stiffened their neck like their fathers. So whenever you hear something stiffening their neck,
Yeah,
what is the imagery?
They're not the
Yep.
They're stubborn.
It's a reference to an animal. What animal?
Donkey.
An ox. Right? An ox in particular, right? An ox, like a stiff-necked ox, is one that refuses to follow guidance. And where does this language first begin? Like, where does it first apply to Israel? What time period?
Very, very earlier in the Torah.
It's in the Torah.
It's in the Torah, I know.
During their years in the
wilderness.
wilderness. Yes, you're a stiff-necked people. Right? And so whenever it says they stiffen their neck like their fathers, it's saying they were acting just like the people in the wilderness. Yep. Nothing's changed. Right? They're telling me I'm outdated. It's been 700 years and they haven't even grown. Right? They haven't even matured. Right? They're still babies. Right? They're still acting like they're whiny, stiff-necked selves. Right? You think that I haven't changed. Neither of you. Right? But the thing is he called them to change. They stiffened their neck like their fathers who did not believe in Yahweh their God. Right? Remember, that's why they were exiled into the wilderness. Right? Because they didn't trust. Who were the two people who trusted that God could save them?
Joshua and Caleb.
Joshua and Caleb. But nobody else did. They also rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he cut with their fathers. So this covenant would refer to the Mosaic covenant, right, made at Mount Sinai, and his warnings with which he warned them. And those warnings would also come in Deuteronomy. And they followed vanity and became vain. When it says vanity, what does it mean there?
When I think of vanity, I think of emptiness.
Yes, that's probably what it is. I haven't looked it up. I'll look it up right now. I imagine the Hebrew word there is hevel. I imagine it's the same word we read in Ecclesiastes, but I will check real quick. It is, yes.
15?
They pursued hevel, right? Emptiness. They pursued meaninglessness, vanity, wind, vapor. They pursued vapor and became vapor. They went after the Gentiles, the nations which surrounded them, concerning which Yahweh had commanded them to not do like them. So, not only did they not... you know what? Brianna and I recently went and saw the Revenge of the Sith 20th anniversary in theaters, right? Star Wars.
Yeah.
Really fun to watch. You know that line where Obi-Wan is yelling at Anakin right before, he like chops him to pieces? Or actually, it's after he chops him to pieces. He says, "You were meant to destroy the Sith, not join them." That's kind of what happens here, right? They were supposed to destroy the Canaanites, not join them, right? They were supposed to destroy the evil from their midst. They were supposed to purge it. They weren't supposed to become it, but that's what they did. They went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which Yahweh had commanded them not to do like them. And they forsook all the commandments of Yahweh, their God, and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves. Why do you think he says even 2 calves?
They were doing the same thing that one of the first kings of the divided monarchy did.
Yeah, but going back even further.
Even further.
They did it whenever Moses came
Yeah.
down and they were worshiping a calf.
Yeah,
Before
what
they
was
even
literally-
got the law.
Yeah, what was literally the first sin they were rebuked for? Pretty much this. Like, once they got the law. Remember? Because God gave the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, and then Moses goes up the mountain to receive the rest of the law. Right? That's Exodus chapters 21 through 31. Chapter 32, he comes down with the tablets, and they're worshiping a golden calf. Literally, he is delivering the law to them, and the first thing they're doing is worshiping a golden calf. Moses breaks the tablets, and he says, "I will fix this," and he goes back up the mountain to restore the covenant. So, literally, the very first thing Israel was ever in trouble for breaking the covenant, it was about a calf. Well, the Northern Kingdom, they made not 1 but 2 calves. So you see how the author's incredulous? He's like, "Are you kidding me? They're stupid." Right? Yes, they forsook all the commandments of Yahweh their God and made for themselves molten images, even 2 calves. It would have been enough to say even 1 calf, but even 2 calves. And they made Asherah and worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. Right? Literally, they're worshiping any god but Yahweh. They're worshiping Baal. Right? Like this dude is terrible. Right? And he's such a small, puny, little, stupid god. Right? And they're worshiping him. It's ridiculous.
It is.
You said it was like us. Explain that.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say that whenever we think about our walk with Christ and what we were before and what we are now, there was a time of transformation in your life, whether it was immediate or slow over time, where you realize what you used to do and what you do now because we live in light of Christ. But there's so many times where we just fall into the same thing, where we go and we repeat things that we used to do before we were, forgiven by Christ and renewed by Him. And it's the same thing that they're doing here. They're going back to the very beginning when they were bottom of the totem pole, and they're doing that again. And we do the same thing, where we just go back to the same things that we're not supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And we know are not good, and yet we do them anyways.
We're just stupid little goofy goobers.
Yeah.
Which honestly, that's probably not even a great joke to make because that's probably making light of the situation.
Really, yeah.
But we are, we're dumb, right? We do this too, right? So it's easy for us to look at Israel and be like, "You're so dumb," but we do the same thing. It's and we can't even say you have the Torah. Yeah, we have more than the Torah. We have 66 books, and God makes His will, His desires, pretty clear, and we have the Spirit dwelling in us. Oh, is that what you were going to say?
I was literally the same. Not only do we have the written word, but we also have the Holy Spirit inside of us, which is more than what they had.
Yeah. I gotta confess real quick. I was about to, I wasn't gonna say the Spirit thing, but then she said, "Ooh," and I was like, "Ooh, what's one thing that she could be about to highlight right now?" And then it just came out of my mouth, and I realized, I think I just stole her thunder, and I feel kind of bad about that. Sorry. In my head, I was like, "Oh man, I can't let her have this," but I was like, "Oh shoot, I think I took that from her." So yeah, I know. That was Y'all just saw that happen right here. So that was crazy. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. Hold up. Whoa. We've only heard of one person doing that so far. And who was that?
Was that king? Was that king?
Yeah, the other king. What is this? Ahab?
Ahaz.
Ahaz. Oh,
King of Judah. Right? King of Judah.
Yeah.
Right? This was in the last chapter, 2 Kings 16. So we've only heard of Ahaz, king of Judah, having a son pass through the fire. But turns out this was actually a regular occurrence. Right? It's like, and it wasn't just in Judah, it was in Israel and Judah.
Oh no.
Right? The only reason we've only heard about it once is because we were mainly focusing on the king. But it turns out the people have been doing this all the time. Right? It says they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. And they practiced divination and omens. And they sold themselves to do what is evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger. Yeah, I'd say. There's one thing. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was chuckling at the provoking him to anger part. That's like, yeah, that would go unspoken.
Yeah, it's like it's a repeat of the same phrase. There was one thing I was wanting to find here. I'm trying to figure out where it's at in the commentary. I'll find it in a second. Alright, so Yahweh was very angry with Israel and caused them to depart from his presence. That's such a sad phrase right there. I imagine in Hebrew that the word presence there is probably face. Right? I really wish that like our English translations maintained the physicality of Hebrew.
Wait, that's from the Torah too, though, right? Wasn't there was a list of different types of judgments that God was going to give if they chose to not follow him, and one of them was that he was going to turn his face away from them.
Yes.
What is that from? What am I referencing?
I don't know, but he says phrases like that.
Because there was like 3 different like phases.
Oh, Deuteronomy 32.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Because he said he was gonna turn his face away from him, and then like the people would rebel against him, and then he was gonna turn to the Gentiles.
Yes.
Like this is 3. Okay.
Yes. So that's actually true. So we see all 3 of those in this, right?
Yeah.
So we have them being brought to next to nothing, which is one of the things. You see him going to the Gentiles, which is another thing, and you see him concealing his face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I looked it up. That is the Hebrew phrase there. It says, so he was causing them to depart from his face, right? So he turned his face away from them. And in this context, his face would be the land itself, right? Because that is where Yahweh dwells. So this is another exile from Eden, right? So that's what this is supposed to be like, right? They're living in, obviously, Israel, like the Promised Land is not as good as Eden, but it was supposed to be the next closest thing. But now they're being kicked out of Eden again, right? They're being kicked out.
What I was just gonna say, I was thinking about this from like Moses' perspective, because he knew before he died. Like if you go and you read the end of Deuteronomy, he's just giving warnings to Israel and telling them, like, hey, this is your history and this is what you've done. Like, don't do it again. Like you have the option when you go into the Promised Land to choose life, basically. And I just think about him thinking about what's happening. Like he knew that they were going to do everything that they were doing, but think about whenever he was on the mountain and all he wanted to do was see God's face. Whenever it was like the burning bush, and he was like, show me like your glory or whatever. And now these people who were under him, they caused him so much stress, are now here where they are literally making God turn his face away from him. It's like the opposite. But since we've been talking about like Exodus, like the parallel of that's kind of cool.
I've always felt just so bad for Moses. Like, imagine you spend 40 years leading this rebellious people through the wilderness, and then finally your time to die has come. Yeah. The reason why you don't get to go in the Promised Land is because you got so mad with them that you struck a rock. And in your parting words, you tell them, guys, this is what you need to do to follow God. And
Chapters
yes, you go on for chapters and chapters, and even as you're saying the words, you know they're not going to listen. Like, I just have, like, in my head, I just think of the image of Moses as he's getting ready to go up the mountain to die. I just see, like, it's an image that kind of haunts me a little bit. I just imagine him looking at the people one final time, and I wish I could see the look on his face. You know, to where it's like, yeah, he's a guy who, like you were just highlighting, his one desire was to see the face of God, right? He just wanted to see him. Yet he knows that these people are going to do anything and everything they can to make God hide his face from them. Right? It's like that has to be so annoying to where it's like he gets it. and they won't, and that just had to be so annoying. But anyways, one thing I was wanting to highlight here, and I'm trying to find where it was. I know it's in this commentary somewhere because I was looking at it earlier. But some people have suggested that there are specifically 10 different ways wherein that they fail in these verses, right? Where like it lists out 10 different specific sins that are attributed to Israel. I for the life of me, I cannot find it in here. That's really gonna annoy me. But what he was like, what the author was suggesting of the commentary was that this was like a contrast or a parallel to the Ten Commandments at the beginning, right? Like, so it's like there's the 10 commands that God gave and the 10 things that they broke. I just don't remember where that is in here. Just trying to find it real quick. Oh, he does say the answer that like it says, why is Hoshea judged a conspirator while Gideon and Samson are celebrated as heroes of the faith? Because Gideon and Samson, they go and do some stuff in regards to the Gentiles, and they're rewarded and called like heroes, whereas Hoshea does stuff and like it's looked at in a negative light. Well, the answer is that Yahweh moves history to the times of the Gentiles, and resisting the new Gentile empire is now resisting God, right? Whereas they should have just paid tribute at that point. Really annoys me that I cannot find this, but that's okay. It's fine. Just trust me, I'll probably find it like the moment that we wrap up tonight, but that's okay. All right, verses 19 to 23. Also, Judah did not keep the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the statutes which Israel had made. So Yahweh rejected all the seed of Israel and afflicted them and gave them into the hand of the plunderers until he had cast them from his face, from his presence. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following Yahweh and made them sin a great sin. And the sons of Israel walked in all the sons of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until Yahweh caused Israel to depart from his face, from his presence, as he spoke through all his slaves, the prophets. So Israel went into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. I wish that I could tell you that the reason it says until this day is because this book was written thousands of years ago. But technically the Bible never tells us about a moment whenever the 10 tribes return. And so technically until this day is true. We read about the Jews, like that's why they're called the Jews, right? Because whenever Judah returns, they go by the name the Jews. It's a shortened form of Judah. But we never hear about the 10 tribes of Israel returning. And so that's why you get all these like weird cults and stuff being like the lost 10 tribes and stuff. People will speculate about that. But yeah, so when it says until this day, technically it is true that we don't actually hear about the return. But we do see that God promises he will eventually bring them back. In many ways, I don't know how y'all feel about this, but it almost feels like this is an obituary for the kingdom. Right? These words in particular, especially verses 21 through 23, it almost feels like this is like a really twisted eulogy where it's like, hey, let's reflect on all Israel's history. And verses 21 through 23 basically summarize 1st and 2nd Kings insofar as Israel is concerned. And it's just a negative portrait. But let's walk through it. I think verses 19 and 20 are probably supposed to be the final blow. When it comes to like all the terrible things that Israel did, I think verses 19 and 20 are supposed to be the final nails in the coffin. Also, Judah did not keep the commandments of Yahweh their God, but walked in the statutes which Israel had made.
So they made their own rules,
Yeah. But
basically.
why do I say this is the final nail in the coffin for Israel? Because it's Judah that it's talking about.
Because they're the one that Israel's the one that made the rules, and
Yeah.
you want to keep them.
Yeah, Israel set the example, right? They should have both been focused on God, but Israel was the first one to depart, right? Israel is the one, like, literally, from the very beginning, as they're going to highlight in verses 21 to 23, from the beginning of Israel's history, they chose, like the Northern Kingdom, from the beginning of the Northern Kingdom's history, they chose to worship other gods. Judah just followed in the footsteps.
It's one of those. It's almost like a parent, like a father. Like, why would you lead your brother that way?
Yeah.
Like, why would you do that? You know that they're watching, kind of thing.
Yeah. And so that's the thing. Is Judah also responsible? Yes. And so Judah will be judged as well. But oftentimes, and I have to get on to my students about this a lot, oftentimes we like to think that there's only one guilty party in any situation. Both people can be guilty. It's just a matter of who has the greater guilt. Well, Judah right now, God's still being patient with them. First off, for the sake of David. And secondly, because, you know what? Judah was led astray. And so he's going to be more patient with them, give them another 150 years. Israel, though, they were the first to depart. Right? They chose to do this from the beginning, and they led Judah astray. Therefore, while Judah is guilty, Israel bears the greater guilt right now. They led their brother astray. So Yahweh rejected all the seed of Israel. Those are hard words. And afflicted them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had cast them from his face. I feel like those words are commentary on their own. Like it's like there's really nothing else to say. It's just like, yeah, like that's harsh. Okay, obituary time. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, first off, who is he? God, right? I guess you could interpret that how you want. I guess you could interpret it as suggesting it's talking about Jeroboam. I know that in English they capitalize the he there, but I think the context is up to you. I think really each one applies. But when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam son of Nebat king. So this goes way back to 1 Kings chapter 12. Right? So we're literally going back to the very beginning when God chose to take away 10 tribes from David. Right? Specifically from Solomon. Right? He had said, Solomon, you really screwed up. You've departed from me. Therefore, I am going to take away these 10 tribes. And do you remember what God had said to Jeroboam? He had made a promise to Jeroboam.
Is it like, you follow me and things will go well? That sort of thing?
Yeah, he said, if you're faithful to me, I will make your kingdom last forever. So basically, he had offered Jeroboam the same thing he offered David. Right? He had essentially offered him an eternal dynasty. But Jeroboam didn't do that. Right? And so, literally, like that's what the author's highlighting here. From the beginning, Jeroboam did some terrible stuff. Right? Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following Yahweh and made them sin a great sin. And you can also see this like quite literally, like the imagery of driving away. It's like a shepherd shooing his animals, right? He drove them away, right? Like a leader is supposed to guide the people, and instead he guided them away from Yahweh. And geographically speaking, I think that you could interpret this in context of the temple, right? God turning his face from them is him casting them from the land. And so in that same imagery, well, remember Jeroboam, do you remember why he created his whole fake religion?
Because the sacrifice is not having to travel a long way.
Yeah, well, he was afraid. What was that?
Oh, I was saying being more convenient, or the people would stop giving sacrifices because they didn't want to travel as far.
Well, he was afraid that, because remember, Jerusalem is in Judah. Jeroboam was afraid that if the people were constantly going down to Jerusalem to worship God, eventually they might realize, you know what? We like worshiping God down here. We miss the people of Judah. Let's reunify. Right? And Jeroboam didn't want that. He wanted power. And so he said, you know what? I'm going to create another religion. He says, let's create these two calves. And these are the calves that took you out of Egypt. Right? And he says, let's go worship them instead. And so he basically created a religion of convenience in order to establish his own power. And so he literally drove them away from God's presence. Right? He drove them from Jerusalem. Right? He said, you don't need to go to the temple anymore. Worship these golden statues. So he made them sin a great sin. He was the opposite of a good shepherd. He was a bad shepherd. And the sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them. That's what's sad, right? Because you literally just highlighted in the previous verses how they departed from every word which Yahweh said, right? God gave them a long list of stuff, and they literally one by one broke all of them. Jeroboam did a very simple thing, and they did not depart from that. Like he did one thing and they stuck to it for 200 years. it's almost like they worship Jeroboam more than they worship Yahweh, right? They even named some of their other kings Jeroboam also. It's like that's how bad it was. And so they did not depart from them until Yahweh caused Israel to depart from his presence. Do you see that eye for eye, tooth for tooth justice? Right? They did not depart from their sin until God made them depart from his face. Right? They wouldn't depart, so he made them depart. But the thing they wouldn't depart from was sin. The thing that he made them depart from was his face. Because he will not remain in the presence of sin. Until Yahweh caused Israel to depart from his presence as he spoke through all his slaves, the prophets. Why do you think it puts the word slaves there?
They
What's the emphasize of the prophets are enslaved? They have to say what they gotta say. Do what they gotta do.
Well, it implies that the prophets are doing what they're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Right? Israel, they have chosen to become slaves again in a negative sense.
Yes.
The prophets were willing slaves of a great
God.
master.
Yes.
Right? God is a good master, and you should be a slave of him. The prophets, they did what they were supposed to do, and then it worked out because guess what? Everything they said came to pass. This is also the author reminding us God is still in control. Right? Everything that happened here is what God said through the prophets. But the thing is, people refuse to listen, so the author is saying, go read the prophets and be reminded that God's word is true. Right? Other people, like Israel, they did not listen to Hosea or Amos. We want to make sure we read Hosea and Amos and take their word seriously. Because if not, we're going to experience the same stuff that Israel experienced. Right? So Israel went into exile from their own land to Assyria until this day. The only difference is that Assyria no longer exists. Right? But the exile goes on. Alright. The back half of this chapter, which I know that we are running low on time here, but that's okay. We always go over anyways. But the back half here is a lot simpler because this is more just telling us what happened to the land after Israel was displaced, right? So there's still a lot worth reflecting on here, but I think a lot of the applicational stuff is more in the previous verses, but there's still some stuff to talk about here. All right, verses 24 to 28. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. Now it happened at the beginning of their settlement there that they did not fear Yahweh. Therefore Yahweh sent lions among them, which were killing them. So they spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations whom you have taken away into exile and settled in the cities of Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land. So he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are putting them to death because they do not know the custom of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you took away into exile, and let him go and live there, and let him instruct them the custom of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had taken away into exile from Samaria came and settled at Bethel, and instructed them how they should fear Yahweh. Alright,
Okay.
cool. So, what happens here?
Very interesting.
It is very interesting.
Judgment.
Oh, and it's this
In one
whole
word, you can summarize this section with the word judgment.
Okay.
I was gonna go a lot of symbolism here in terms like that. God turned his face away from his people, but now is like you can see he's like starting to go out to the Gentiles here, right?
Mm-hmm. A little bit.
Did you say symbolism?
Symbolism in a way. He's like I guess he's indirectly going out to the Gentiles because it seems like he sent lions and that resulted in the king of Assyria being like, fine, I don't want you guys getting killed, I'll give you one of their priests and he can teach you how to obey their God.
Oh, I just found the 10 violations thing. Of course. It says, Israel's breach of covenant is evident in the 10 violations listed in chapter 17, verses 15 through 17, numerically matching the 10 words of Moses that summarize the original covenant in which Israel receives the land. Sorry. I just wanted to highlight that. I was trying to find something about the lions, because I know he said something about that too. Sorry. Where's it at? That's the issue with this commentary. I highlight so many things that it's hard to find the stuff I was actually wanting to say.
How come? Oh, no.
Oh, okay. As Nelson notes, the situation after Israel is removed is little different from the situation before. Assyria resettles the land with foreigners, 2 Kings 17:24, who bring their gods with them, and Yahweh sends lions to attack the idolaters, which, if you remember, happened back in 1 Kings 13 as well. Right? Remember how there was like this man of God from Judah who went up to Israel, and remember there was this lion that attacked him and killed him? It was a really weird story.
Yeah.
Well, hey, now we also have people in Israel with foreign gods and lions attack them. It's like, it's nothing's different. So, if anything, this is highlighting the fact that even with Gentiles living in the land, nothing has changed. Right? That's how bad Israel was. Like, they're just, it's the same. Just, the difference is that Israel was actually guilty because they knew better, right? They had the Torah, and they should have known better, yet they chose to sin. Whereas these people, they at least realized, oh, crud, I think God's mad at us. We should probably figure out about this God. So, so the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon. Hey, that's our first mention of Babylon. I wonder if they're going to be a big deal later on. Hint, hint, they will be. And from Kuthla, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. This is how the Assyrians did things, right? They would displace people. And so they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. Important New Testament information here. This is going to be the thing which gives birth to the Samaritan people, right? Eventually, whenever the people do return from exile, right? We don't hear about an official return of the 10 tribes in the Bible, but presumably at some point they were allowed to return as well. I'm imagining during the Persian time period. We just don't really hear about an official thing. But eventually people do return back to the land of Israel. And because there's so many pagans living there, what happens is they begin to intermingle, right? And keep in mind, whenever they dispossessed the Israelites, it's not like every single Israelite was taken out of the land, right? Most of them, like a lot of them were. Some of them were left there. Usually it was the wealthy people who were exiled, and the poor people were left to stay, right? And so what happens from this point forward, this really does shape things like quite a bit, is that over the course of the next 700 years, right? Because this is 722 BC, over the course of the next 700 years, the Israelites and the pagans and the Gentiles here, they begin to intermingle. And as a result, whenever the Jews return from exile, they do not like the people living up north. Because these people are like, they're half-breeds, right? From a Harry Potter perspective, they're mudbloods, right? I guess not mudbloods, they're more half-bloods. But the idea is that they're mixed, right? And you'll even see this whenever the Jews return and they're rebuilding the temple. There will be some people from Samaria who come and they say, hey, can we help out? And the Jewish people say, no, you cannot help out because you are unclean, right? Because they're compromisers. And so over time, there ends up being this divide between the people down in Judah and the people up in Samaria, right? Because the Samaritans are viewed as compromisers who are half-breeds and they're not totally pure. And what ends up happening as a result of that is that the Samaritans end up developing their own religion, right? To where they end up only observing the first 5 books of the Old Testament, right? The Torah, right? And they even change certain aspects of it. And they even build their own temple on a mountain called Gerizim. And by the time you get to the New Testament, the Jewish people do not like the Samaritans. And it all starts with this moment right here, right? So that explains whenever you get to the New Testament and Jesus shares the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's why it's such a scandalous story. Because in the story, there's this guy who is beaten up, and 2 Jewish people walk by and neglect him. And then a Samaritan walks by and helps him out. And the Jewish people are like, the Samaritans are terrible. How dare you make the Samaritan a hero in your story? And Jesus says, yeah. I know, crazy, right? Or Jesus, is so scandalous, the first person he reveals his messianic identity to is a Samaritan woman by a well. And that's scandalous, right? Because it's a Samaritan. And most people would go around Samaria, but Jesus went through. And so that I just want to highlight that. That all starts here, right? There's 700 years of racial prejudice that develop from this point to the New Testament, and Jesus kind of shows up and just starts breaking that down. Now it happened at the beginning of the settlement there that they did not fear Yahweh. Therefore, Yahweh sent lions among them, which were killing them. Now, I find that interesting. What's so interesting about that, though?
The fact that God would use lions to kill them?
Yes, but also, like, would you expect them to fear Yahweh?
No.
They're Gentiles, right? Like, they're just displaced people who were forced to live here. It seems kind of weird that, like, I mean, like, you wouldn't expect them to, right? But what does this communicate?
That, like, God's still like in control of the situation.
Yeah, and what is it?
It's like it's my land. You guys are not supposed to like be here if you're not serving me.
Yes, and that's actually really interesting, right? Like, that communicates something theologically that I think a lot of Christians forget. The land of Israel itself is special in the eyes of God, right? Like, that is like his home, like it is the land that he has picked as his chosen possession, right? This also goes back to Deuteronomy 32. I'm sorry, I bring it up a lot. But it says that, actually, let me just go quote it real quick, just because it'll be easier for me to quote it than to summarize it. If I could flip there. Deuteronomy 32 says, okay, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. So it goes back to the Tower of Babel, right? Whenever the nations were dispersed, God appointed different Elohim, right? Different sons of God, over different jurisdictions, right? But God picked Israel as his home base, right? Israel was his Garden of Eden, right? That was his, like, the land was his Holy of Holies. And even if you remember Naaman the leper, right? Whenever he came down, after he had been cleansed in the Jordan River, he said, could I have a bag of dirt to bring back with me back home? And the reason why is because he wanted to worship God on his home turf. And so even though the Gentiles, you wouldn't expect them to fear Yahweh, God says, this is my home, right? Like, yes, he is the God of all creation, but they have entered into a holy place. They have entered into the promised land. And therefore, regardless of whether or not they should have been expected to fear him, they should be doing it, right? It's kind of like the story of whenever, remember the Ark of the Covenant being brought into Jerusalem, and it begins to fall, and one guy just tries to catch it. What happens to that guy?
Dead.
He dies. Now, did he do anything wrong? Well, no, he was just trying to stabilize it. But the issue is it's the presence of God, right? And you can't, like, it's like, yeah, like he, I don't know, like he shouldn't have done it, right? Because like it's a matter of holiness, right? You cannot be in the God's presence like that without just being just totally vaporized, right? And so, I mean, he didn't just like disintegrate, he just like fell over. But it's the same idea, right? It's like they're in the land, and it says, if you're in my land, you will honor me. Now, did they have the Torah? No. But still, God expected, like, you're in my land, you need to honor me like that. And good for them, they actually, like, pick up on it pretty quick, right? I mean, it seems like lions were coming out and, like, I imagine every now and then people just naturally got into a scrape with a lion, but it seems like people were being killed by lions to, like, an unsettling degree, right? To where it's like, okay, like, it's like all of a sudden if, like, I don't know, you heard that, like, every time somebody went on a run at the Seabrook Trails, like a wild boar just like killed him. You'd be like, okay, for it to happen once is weird, but like that's happening a lot. It's like so they pick up real quick, something divine is happening. So they spoke to the king of Assyria saying, the nations whom you have taken away into exile. Notice that it says the nations. It seems like they're not even fully aware of what was going on, right? Because really it was only one nation that was displaced. It was Israel. But they say the nations. The nations whom you have taken away into exile and settled in the cities of Samaria do not know the customs of the God. Oh, sorry, no, I misspoke there. It's referring to the nation, like them being brought into the land. I was thinking it was like a parallel to whenever the Philistines thought that Israel had multiple gods. Whenever it said like, oh, they're calling out to their gods, but it's not parallel. The nations whom you have taken away into exile and settled in the cities of Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land. So he has set lions among them, and behold, they're putting them to death because they do not know the custom of the God of the land. So they pick up pretty quick. A lot of our people are dying, and it seems like it's a religious thing. And again, this is just how this is how ancient people viewed the world, right? Nowadays, we will try to find every possible natural explanation of something before we ascribe it to God, and that is because, in many ways, science has. I'm not saying it's made us better. I'm saying it's actually crippled us. We have adopted a very naturalistic worldview of the world. And I'm not against science, but I'm saying I think we probably need to re-adopt a supernatural worldview, and we realize that God interacts with the world. These people were the opposite, right? These people, from their perspective, God was very much interacting with the world. And if this stuff is happening, they're saying this is obviously a sign from the gods. But they don't know anything about Yahweh. They don't even know his name. They're just like, who's the God of this land? Because he obviously is not happy with us. So the king of Assyria commanded, saying, take there one of the priests whom you took away into exile, and let him go and live there. And let him instruct them in the custom of the God of the land. Alright, so what does the king of Assyria say?
He's like, go get one of the priests and let him teach you.
Yeah, just go get a priest and let him help you out. I will say, there's something slightly ironic here. Because if the priest was living in the land, what does that probably say about him?
The probability of them picking a good priest is very slim.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. All because a priest, I don't know. I'm assuming that maybe, I don't know. Maybe they lucked out, but yeah, the probability of them choosing a good priest is not high.
I figured he's probably just going to say, just keep doing what you're doing, do this a little differently, though.
Yes. Yeah, so, but it's funny. The king of Syria, I love that he, doesn't question them. He's like, oh, yeah, the gods are sending lions after you? Alright, don't worry, I got you. It's I just love, it's just a very different worldview than we would, expect, right? Imagine that's how people talk nowadays, right? Imagine, I don't know, imagine the U.S., conquered a place, and we, displaced their people, and, I don't know, we, sent them to, I don't know, Mexico, right? And then we took people from Mexico and, displaced them somewhere else. And then people, got to Mexico, and they're like, hey, for some reason, a lot of... Actually, no, I want to change it a little bit. Let's say it's Australia, just because this makes my story better, right? Let's say that we put people in Australia, and then all of a sudden people are like, hey, so, a lot of people have been getting killed by, kangaroos lately? We don't know what that's about, but we think the gods are angry. Usually, we would expect that President Biden would be like, y'all are crazy. What are you talking about? But in this context, President Biden's like, oh, we do not want the gods to be angry, so, we will send, I don't know. It's very funny for us to laugh at, but the thing is, according to the author, that is exactly what's happening. No, God did send lions. Lions were devouring the people. They correctly diagnosed the issue, and this is the correct solution. That's what, it's a very funny story, but also, it's true. And you're like, oh, that makes it, even weirder.
And it seems, verse 28, it makes it seem like they picked a good priest, too.
Yeah, it kind of implies that. We don't know for sure.
Yeah.
But it seems to imply that, right? So one of the priests whom they had taken away into exile from Samaria came and settled at Bethel and instructed them how they should fear Yahweh. So it does seem like this guy at least is attempting, right? The question really becomes, does he know how to fear Yahweh? Because if he did, I guess maybe he was an exception, right? The issue is that it makes you wonder whether or not this priest was at Bethel at the time, because it seems like Bethel was the leading place of going against God. But I'm assuming that maybe the king of Assyria did his due diligence and said, hey, we're looking for people who aren't responsible for y'all being in exile right now, right? I'm assuming we want people to enjoy their time in y'all's land because we don't want them rebelling against us, and so it seems like they probably sent a good priest, but it probably was a pretty good search, right? Verses 29 through 33. Brianne, could you possibly read those for us? Because I need to go grab something from the other room.
Yeah.
Right.
But each nation was still making gods of its own, and put them in the houses of the high places which the people of Samaria had made, each nation in their cities in which they lived. And the men of Babylon made Succoth-Benoth, the men of Cuth made Nergal, the men of Hamath from Ashima, and the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak, and the Sephirites burned their children in the fire to Adramelech and Anamelech, the gods of the Sepharvaim. They were also fearing Yahweh and appointed from among all themselves priests of the high places, and they were acting for them in the houses of the high places. They were fearing Yahweh and serving their own gods according to the custom of the nation from among whom they had taken away into exile.
Awesome.
That's weird.
It's weird. So
Yeah. So what happens here?
burning
It's
their
basically
children.
saying you're fearing God, but they're still serving other gods, which is kind of contradicting.
Yeah, they're split. And in general, how does the Bible feel about people who are trying to straddle the line?
Can't do it?
Pick one or the other.
Yeah. You choose this day who you will serve, right? You can't do all of them. I apologize that the verses that I gave you were like
Those
the
are
ones with
quite
like the
some
crazy names.
I couldn't even focus
But
on
that's
that.
actually why I wanted to go to the other room, because I wanted to grab. There's a commentary that like I knew would explain this stuff, and it just will save me time from having to go through it myself. But each nation was still making gods of its own and put them into the house of the high places which the people of Samaria had made, each nation in their cities in which they lived. Right? So Samaria had made all these temples and high places, and so the other people, they just repurpose them. Right? They don't tear them down or anything. I'm assuming the priest is like, you need to tear these down, and they're like, nah, we're gonna just repurpose them and make them new religious centers. And so they make their own idols, which represent the gods of their own lands, and they put them up here. And the men of Babylon made Succoth Benoth. The men of Cuth made Nergal. The men of Hamath made Ashima. And the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. And the Sepharvites burned their children in the fire to Adremelech and Anamelech, the gods of Sepharvaim. So really cool names. Almost sounds like something from Lord of the Rings. So what's going on in those verses?
Child sacrifice,
Indeed.
idol worship,
Tears of wine.
creation of their own gods, and continuation of serving gods that might have existed before they moved into the land of Israel.
Yeah, and that's really what it is. Basically, it's just I guess like syncretism is how you can kind of describe it. Like they're just they're blending the religions, right? They're like, okay, we're gonna take Yahweh worship and we're gonna take some of what we had from our old life and we're gonna merge them, which is also something that's very, very dangerous. This actually reminds me of something that we see in The Chosen, right? In the show, the way that they depicted Judas Iscariot in the show. We don't have any biblical reason to think that this is exactly what his backstory was, but Judas in the show, he was a businessman before he was called to be an apostle. And throughout the show, the thing that he's struggling with is that he keeps wanting to view his discipleship in terms of business, right? And he's constantly wanting to give Jesus advice, and he's trying to help Jesus like cut the deal in the sense of, win people over and stuff like that. And he's always thinking in terms of money. And at one point, I think it's probably in season 4, there's somebody who kind of confronts Judas over this. And they point out that they all had different backgrounds, but Jesus called them to leave those backgrounds and become something different, right? So Matthew was a tax collector, but he's not a tax collector anymore. Peter was a fisherman, but he's not a fisherman anymore, right? Simon was a zealot, but he's not a zealot anymore, right? Whereas Judas is trying to blend them. And that's a danger that we fall into as well, right? Where we try to almost syncretize things, right? We try to, we want to say, okay, well, this is who I was before I became a Christian, and now I want to blend that into my walk with God. Whereas, in reality, you just need to submit to God and let Him make you who He wants to make you to be, right? You have to realize that you really can't contribute anything to Him other than faith, right? And He will shape you, right? And He will make you into something. Does that mean that you have to totally abandon what you were doing before? Not necessarily, but it might require that. In their case, they should have abandoned their paganism. I just wanted to read this one thing. This is from the Cultural Backgrounds Study Bible. It's just talking about those gods. Like Succoth, Benoth, Nergal, all that stuff. The only deities in this list who are clearly known from other sources are the West Semitic god Ashima and the Mesopotamian god Nergal, who was an underworld god associated with famine, drought, plague, and death, and whose cult was centered in the city of Cutha. The combination Succoth Benoth alludes to at least the goddess alludes at least to the goddess Banitu and possibly also to Sakut or Ninurta. Nibhaz and Tartak may be Elamite deities, while Adramelech and Anamelech may be Phoenician and Amorite gods, respectively. Right? So, basically, all it's highlighting there is that we don't know much about those gods, which ties into something that George was saying earlier, that all these other gods have faded from existence, right? Because they are not the one true God. Whereas Yahweh, who is arguably the God of the smallest of these territories, he still endures, right? Israel's just a tiny little area, but their God is the God whom technically Jewish people, Christians, and Muslims all claim to worship in a different form or fashion, right? So just want to highlight that. So they were also fearing Yahweh and appointed from among all of themselves priests of the high places, and they were acting for them in the houses of the high places. So that there you see just the contradiction, right? They're fearing Yahweh, and they're doing a bunch of stuff that proves they do not fear Yahweh. I imagine this is, the author writes this with his tongue like firmly planted in his cheek. He's being sarcastic. Oh, they were fearing Yahweh, and they did this, and this, which, as I will remind you, the Israelites were just kicked out of the land because it demonstrated they did not fear God. They were fearing Yahweh and serving their own gods, according to the custom of the nations, from among whom they had been taken away into exile. So you see the phrase repeated. They were fearing God and not fearing God. They were fearing God and not fearing God. Which, again, is something we have to be aware of. Like, we have to be aware of ourselves. Because, honestly, I've heard people say phrases like this. I've probably said phrases like this. I hope not. But where they say, you know what, I love God, but... And then they say something else, right? It's like, I love God, but man, do I really love such and such. It's like, if you have to say I love God, but, we've got an issue. Because what you're about to follow it up with is something which you yourself are admitting does probably not align with loving God, right? I fear God, but man, oh man, do I love lying? It's like, I don't know, like that's a stupid example, but we did the lights just flicker?
I just
Okay, I didn't know if like I just
Not a good
blinked.
sign.
Yeah, I thought I blinked. That was weird.
I
Okay.
blinked and I saw like a flash of light, so I'm like, what was that?
Yeah, that was weird.
Saul, why are you persecuted? But yeah, so I just think we need to be cautious of stuff like this, right? Where it's like, oh yes, I worship God, and I also gossip, and I serve myself, and I try to make sure that I set aside me time to love myself, and it's like you can't do both, right? But we tend to do that a lot, right? To where whenever it's this overt, it's easy for us to be like those idiots, but whenever it's more subtle things,
It's like,
yeah, was that?
it's like pointing a gun at somebody and then like having it backfire at you.
Yeah, and another thing worth highlighting here is that the reason why it's easy for us to call them out on it is because they are not us, right? And you probably find yourself doing this with other people too, where you look at them and you're like, I don't get, like we're like, you hypocrite. That's what this is called, hypocrisy, right? Where we look at them and we say, I can't believe you would claim to worship God, but then do X, Y, and Z. You hypocrite. And it's easy for us to point that out in our friends, in our family, and people around us, but oftentimes we don't notice that in ourselves, right? And that's because we are biased. And what's also ironic about that is the fact that we don't notice it in ourselves shows that we're guilty of it. Because we say, I love God, but I'm way more judgmental of others than I am of myself, which is not honoring God, right? And so the mere fact that we notice other people's faults more than ourselves proves that we do this all the time. All right. We are getting near the end here. These are the final verses, I believe, right? Am I correct? Yes, this is. All right. To this day, they are acting according to the earlier customs. They are not fearing Yahweh. They are not acting according to their statutes or their judgments or the law or the commandment which Yahweh commanded the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel, with whom Yahweh cut a covenant and commanded them, saying, you shall not fear other gods, nor worship them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and with an outstretched arm, him you shall fear. And to him you shall worship, and to him you shall sacrifice. And the statutes and the judgments and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall be careful to do forever. And you shall not fear other gods. And the covenant that I have cut with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. But Yahweh your God you shall fear, and he will deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. However, they did not listen. They did not hear. But they were acting according to their earlier custom. So while these nations were fearing Yahweh, they also were serving their graven images. Their children likewise, and their grandchildren. As their fathers acted, so they are acting this way to this day. These verses are very interesting to end on. What standard is the author holding the nations up to?
The Israelites.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Just by the Gentiles being placed into the land of Israel, they are now being held to the standard of the Israelites according to the Torah. I think that this kind of points forward to the New Testament. In the sense of the idea of, what's that?
Being grafted in.
Yeah, I think it points to the idea of Gentiles being grafted into Israel, right? Like for us, right? So we would currently state that Israel, again, in our life, like right now in the church age, we would say that Israel is in a time of hardening, right? Where God has gone to the Gentiles, which would include us. And God holds us to bear the covenant, right? And so I think that this is kind of foreshadowing that, right? The Gentiles, I think the main difference is that, well, actually, I guess there's not a big difference because these nations have vowed to worship Yahweh, right? They got into the land, they realized lions were attacking them, and they said, we will serve God. And so they've committed to him, and therefore, because they have committed to him, God has grafted them into Israel, right? And he has said, okay, you might not be Israelites, but I am going to bring you into the covenant. And now I'm holding you accountable to that covenant. And so basically, in many ways, these people right here are the proto-Christians. But I think, if anything, they highlight the need for Christ. Because are they doing a very good job of following the covenant?
No,
Not at all.
they're not.
Right? They're doing a terrible job of following the covenant. And so it shows the need for a Savior to show up and ultimately lay down his life for us so that we can be redeemed and we can receive the Spirit to equip us to live for him. Because if Christ hadn't died and resurrected, we would be just like them. Right? We would be absolutely screwed. Right? We would be trying to live for God, but this would be the best we could do. Whereas now we can say that obviously we can actually walk faithfully. Right? And whenever we choose to depart, it's because we are just sinful people who don't follow well. But okay, let's walk through these verses fairly quickly just so that we can... I was going to say get home, but I'm already at home. So y'all can get home. To this day, they are acting according to the earlier customs. What does it mean when it says the earlier customs?
Gods they were serving before, or it could refer to the same customs that the Israelites were doing prior to the Assyrians.
Yeah.
Conquering them.
I think it's the first thing that you said. I think it's they are walking away, like their former way of life before they arrived in the land of Israel. Right? They are acting like they are still separated from the covenant of God.
They're like, yeah, this Yahweh God's here. Let's just sprinkle a little bit of that on everything and it'll be okay.
Yeah. What this brings to mind to me is Ephesians chapter 2. Right? Paul is writing to Gentile Christians. He says, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you formerly walked, according to the course of this world, according to the ruler of the power of the air, and the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all also formerly conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, doing the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. Right? So this is how Paul describes the Gentiles before coming to Christ. But then he says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. By grace are you saved. And then he goes into the, by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not your own doing. It's the free gift of God. But to me, these verses call to mind that same passage. Right? These people were formerly walking in disobedience. Now they're in the land of Israel. They have voiced commitment to Yahweh, but they're not serving him well. And so they're the opposite of what Paul talked about in Ephesians 2. They are people who said they were going to abandon their former ways, yet they're still walking in them. And really, that's what Paul's arguing for in Ephesians 2. He's saying you need to stop doing that, right? You need to make sure you are living, like if you have been saved by grace through faith, you are now God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Therefore, no longer walk in the ways that you once walked, right? This is a big argument that Paul makes. And so, In many ways, this is the prototype for Christianity, but they're just failing. They're not acting according to the statutes, or their judgments, or the law, or the commandment which Yahweh commanded the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel. So again, he's holding these Gentiles to the standard of Israel, to the Torah. Why do you think that it says the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel?
Well, because Jacob was once, Israel was once Jacob.
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on here. I think that it mentions the sons of Jacob in particular because it's reminding us as the readers that these commands were not just given to the northern kingdom. They were given to all the sons of Jacob, but if it just said Israel, because technically that is what all 12 tribes are, but that'd be confusing because at this time period, the name Israel applies to the 10 tribes. So he says, God gave these commands to all the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel, right? So he gave them to everybody, including Judah down below, right? And also, the name Israel, what does it mean?
Israel.
It means to wrestle with God,
Yeah.
right? And that has been Israel's story. They've wrestled with God constantly. They're in exile. And it turns out that these Gentiles are doing the same thing. With whom Yahweh cut a covenant and commanded them, saying, you shall not fear other gods, nor worship them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. But Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt with great power and an outstretched arm, him you shall fear, to him you shall worship, to him you shall sacrifice. So who did God say all this to? Israel, right? This is in the Torah, right? This is what God said to Israel, but now he's holding this, like the Samaritans, to it. And the statutes and the judgments and the law and the commandment which he wrote to you, you shall be careful to do forever. You shall not fear other gods. The covenant that I have cut with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. But Yahweh your God you shall fear, he shall deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. So all those things are things he said to Israel in the Torah, but now that the Gentiles are living in the land, he's holding them to the Torah as well. Right? So you see, this is what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus does not abolish the law. Right? All because we are Gentiles does not mean that the law is just gone. We might relate to it in a slightly different way, but we are still called to the heart of the law. Which, what did we say the heart of the law was earlier tonight? What was the law calling us to?
Faithfulness.
Faith. Right? It calls us to faithfulness. You shall worship no other God but Yahweh. Right? It's all down to that first command, and then that flows out in a life transformation. Right? And so the Gentiles, they're being called to the same thing. Right? Now, did God expect them to wear the tassels and stuff like that? I don't know. I doubt it. Right? I think that God wanted them to be faithful. Right? And it should have demonstrated itself in external action. But they're not doing it. And so in verse 40, we read that they did the same thing that Israel did. They did not listen. They did not hear. But they were acting according to their earlier custom. So they said they were going to change, but they didn't. It's like the church camp effect. Right? Whenever people go off to church camp, they say, I'm never going to be the same. They go back home, and they return back to their old habits. And we do this a lot too. Right? These are the people who, every Sunday at church, they pray the sinner's prayer. And they say, all right, I'm a Christian now. And then nothing changes, right?
I think I understand why people get that, why young people get that feeling when they go to church camp is because they're surrounded by a community of.
Well, and they're acting more off emotion than they are on faith. And sometimes I get critical of church camps because they sometimes plant the false, like we actually sometimes do more harm than good because we almost communicate to people that that's what faith is. It's like this ecstasy moment where it's like this crest up here. Whereas I think we need to teach people more how to be faithful even when you're not feeling it, and so I think sometimes we harm kids with that. I've always thought that church camps are better for people who have a strong walk with God already, and it's almost like a useful getaway to refocus on Him. Whereas for people who are young believers, sometimes it can be harmful because it gives them the false understanding of what walking with God looks like. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't go. I think we need to be mindful of that. However, they did not listen, but they were acting according to their earlier custom, so they didn't change. So while these nations were fearing Yahweh, they also were serving their graven images. AKA, they weren't really fearing Yahweh. Fearing Yahweh is kind of used here in a sarcastic manner, right? It's being used in the sense of they were going through the motions, right? I guess you could describe them as God-fearing individuals, but it's kind of the same way where, I don't know, you don't really see this nowadays. Actually, you might, but like people in the middle America, like farmers and stuff like that, like people from Kansas, sometimes you'll hear them described as like, oh, that's a God-fearing man right there. Now, does that mean that he actually has a relationship with God? No, but usually they're described that way to just say they're a really upstanding individual, right? To where, yeah, they're a God-fearer in the sense of, I don't know, they're all right. And that's kind of how it's being used here. These nations were fearing Yahweh in theory, but they were also serving their graven images. They were fearing a bunch of gods. Their children likewise, and their grandchildren, as their fathers acted, so they are acting this way to this day. So that's also interesting, right? So we see that just like God was patient with Israel, so he's patient with the Gentiles, right? Because according to the author, this is still going on. And we know the author is writing at least 150 years after this, right? Because the author is going to go all the way through the destruction of Judah. We don't really know who wrote 2 Kings, but people speculate it was maybe Jeremiah, the prophet. But yeah, so that is the end of 2 Kings 17. Final takeaways, what do y'all think? Application-wise.
One thing is, when you say that you can be faithful to God, actually act on it.
Yep.
Don't just say it and then don't do it.
Yeah. The prophets, Jesus quotes them, I forget which prophet, I think it's Isaiah, where it says, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Don't be like that, right? That's what Israel was doing. That's what these Gentiles are doing. Let's make sure we're not doing that.
Pharisees are pretty much doing.
Exactly. That's who he quoted. That's who Jesus quoted him against.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
I would say it's good to reflect on the past and where you've been, because that was like a big downfall of Israel, was that they were resorting back to things that they had already done in their past. Maybe not those people at the time, but their history, their stories that have been passed down. That's something that like we can reflect in our own life. Like, where have I been, and what have I done, and what has God taught me, what is right and wrong, and how should I learn from that and move forward in my life?
Yeah.
What should I fix? What should I repeat? What should I not do again?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that as Christians, we need to become masters of self-examination. And I do not mean that we need to hyperfixate on ourselves. Mm-hmm. But what I mean is that we should constantly be looking at the things we're doing and asking, why do I do the things I'm doing? Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, like I'll ask my students this all the time. I'll say, why did you do that thing? And they're like, I don't know. I just did it. Mm-hmm. Whereas for me, I want to be the type of person, if you ask me, David, why did you do the thing you just did? I want to be able to explain why I did it. Because that means I'm being intentional with my actions. And that means I need to examine myself and ask, okay, am I doing, like, what I'm doing right here, like this action I'm choosing to do, does that flow from a biblical conviction, and is it consistent with a walk with God? Or does it flow from a cultural practice? And I think that Christians honestly have become very bad at this. To where there are so many places in Christianity where we just adopt the practices of our culture. Yeah. This is something I've been honestly wrestling with this at my job right now, where there's a lot of things where I've been wrestling through. I'm like, man, I don't think we're doing X, Y, and Z because it's consistent with Scripture. I think we're doing it just because that's the way things are in schools. And it's actually like there's a place where it's been like I've been brushing up against it. So I'm like, I don't think that's necessarily right. And as Christians, we need to constantly examine ourselves, and we need to ask, why am I doing this? Is this me just mixing with culture? Because there are times where it's not inherently bad to mix with culture, right? I mean, whenever you look at the Jewish people, there were times where they embraced things, right? Solomon hired a Gentile dude to design the temple of God, right? Like whenever you look throughout Israelite history, there are plenty of places where Gentiles had an influence on Hebrew culture. But sometimes they're criticized for it because it's a matter of like why you're doing it. It's about your motives, right? Are you doing this because you want to be more worldly? Or are you doing it because you've examined it and you realize, I can do this without compromising my faith, right? And we need to examine ourselves, right? And we need to reflect, like Rand was saying, on our past and say, who was I before? And how am I becoming more like Christ? And are there any things that I'm doing right now which actually aren't helping me become more like Christ? They're actually keeping me stagnant because they're actually coming from the world. right? We don't want to do that. And I think that's a really good lesson to learn from this chapter for sure. Final closing thing, quote from the commentary. This is the very end of the chapter. Israel came into the land charged with the duty of purging the land of pagan shrines and establishing Yahweh's worship. In a tragic reversal, the land is back to its pre-conquest state, full of idolatrous shrines. Even exile does not change the face of the northern kingdom. This is Israel's Good Friday, the dark day of being cast from the face of God. Israel dies, and there's only a distant rumor of resurrection, and you read that in verse 39, right? But Yahweh your God you shall fear; He will deliver you from the hand of your enemies, right? So you have this distant ring of resurrection. It is like another dark day when the one true Israelite bears the sins of his people on a Roman cross. When from the darkness the true Israel cries, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right? So this chapter is Israel's Good Friday. But the good news is that God is faithful, and so Sunday is coming. And Israel will return from exile, and God's promises will be fulfilled. I was going to say plans and promises, and I said promises. Earlier today at school, I was trying to say your job and your goal, and I ended up saying your Joel.
Just go with it, and they'll pick it up. Like, it'll be a new word. Put it in the comments.
Oh,
Your Joel.
Not with my students. They will just tease you about it forever. But, all right. Can I get one of y'all to pray for us to close this out?
I'll go ahead and do it.
Go for it, Ben.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us here together to study your word, and help us, Lord, to be like Christ, and not necessarily like Israel, but like your Son Jesus, and help us to transform this world by just going out there and being like you. Thank you, God, for your love for us, and please keep us safe as we go home. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
And I want to add a personal prayer that this last week I've been considering going to school and what I should do. This next week I plan to look into school, and I think whatever the Lord's plan is, just maybe for all of us 2026, summertime, just whatever's best and whatever's the most good we can do towards whatever God's plan is. So I pray for all of us, and I pray for myself. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Cool.